Now, in this video, we will cover Cube licensing and what are some of the changes that have happened with respect to Cube licensing, the new SKUs, and how the session count is determined, and what does a trunk license include and what it does not. So, and some of the migration options when you have a current platform. So before we go into the Cube licensing, right? So the key thing to keep in mind is that you need to have the platform licensing prior to enabling the Cube feature set, right? So before you can configure Cube on any platform or before you can license, think about Cube. Make sure the platform technology and throughput licensing required is purchased and installed on the box or set up on the box, right? So, and then if you plan on doing TLS, SIP TLS, ensure you have the appropriate licensing for TLS as well. We'll share some of the example, but again, please refer to the platform, meaning the hardware models documentation to get the latest information. When it comes to the ISR 1100 series, the 4000 series, which is the 43 4400 series, these platforms require the unified communication and the security K9 technology packages, right? Security K9 only required if you plan on doing SRTP and SIP over TLS, right? But unified communication is required for you to be able to access the Cube CLI, and that is known as the UCK9. Both of these are generally, this is the, as of this recording, this is has been the CLI, or this is the CLI that is used to enable both the UCK9 and the security K9 package. For the cloud services router, which is the virtual router CSR 1000 V series, those virtual routers, when you run Cube as part of the virtual routers, it's known as the vCube. So for cloud services routers, they have their own licensing, and those licensing includes term duration, the required throughput, and the required feature package, right? So they have, for example, the AX package, the Apex package, uh, the AX and the Apex package supports vCube option. Between AX and Apex, the difference is with Apex you don't get SIP TLS SRTP. You just get unencrypted Cube call flows. If you're looking for example, Cube in a cloud deployment as a local gateway, you have to do SIP TLS and SRTP. So then you have to have AX package of the virtual router. So the example below displays CLI required for enabling 1 gigabits per second throughput, how to increase memory configuration, and enabling the AX package on the virtual router. And all these are license options. So this is the CLI to enable AX. This is the CLI to get the throughput to 1 gigabits per second. And in some cases, if you need to increase memory configuration, that's the CLI. For the ASR 1000 series, um, Advanced IP Services and Advanced Enterprise Services supports Cube, and this is the CLI. Advanced IP Services is more common, but if you have Advanced Enterprise Services as well, Cube Enterprise is supported on Advanced Enterprise as well. So ensure prior to getting to the Cube license, you have the underlying platform, technology, and throughput licensing needed to support Cube deployment. Now, coming to the Cube licensing, um, we will come to we'll talk about what is the smart licensing. Basically, smart licensing is a license inventory management system for all Cube products, or rather all Cisco products. And we have migrated Cube right to use licenses, which used to be paper license, right? So Cube license were something that did not require installation on the box, and it was just a piece of paper you used to get with the authorization enabling you to use Cube on that particular box itself. So smart licensing by default entitles the customer and not the product instance. No more packs are required, and since and it provides the pooling or flexible option. Since it entitles the customer can use their license on any different product, right? Meaning, for example, in case of Cube, if you have Cube smart license enabled Cube licensing in your account, you can use that on box A, and tomorrow you can use it on box B. Meaning, if you have it for 4321 and you decide, okay, I'm upgrading my platform to 4451, you don't have to repurchase smart enabled Cube licenses. So smart licensing allows for pooling and transferability between different product instances, since it entitles the customer and not the product itself. Okay, so Cube licenses have moved to Smart as well, and let's do a quick recap of some of the Cube deployment scenarios. What you're seeing over here is a SIP trunking to a service provider, which is the classic Cube deployment scenario. You have on-premises call control where the endpoints are registered, and the call control has a trunk to Cube, and then Cube has a SIP trunk over a transport to the service provider. That is the Cube trunk scenario. And the Cube trunking license used to be a whole lot of SKUs, as you're seeing over here in this on the left side of the slide. What we have done is we have consolidated all of them and issued an end of sale on all of these old SKUs and brought them down to just three different SKUs. The first one is the Cube T STD, and the second one is Cube T Red, and then we have the Cube T Red Up. Cube T STD is a standalone box Cube license on the trunk side where you're terminating SIP trunks from a service provider on the box. The Cube T Red is purely Cube high availability active standby SKU. Back in the day, the redundant SKU used to be required for active load balancing, but pooling and transferability is default in smart licensing, so you no longer need the red license for geographic redundancy. Cube T red license is purely and only for active standby Cube HA for call preservation. If you start with a standalone license and you want to upgrade to a redundant, this is the SKU Cube T Red Up that you will use. All these licenses require a Swiss. Okay, what's included in a trunk license? In the trunk license, we showed the deployment use case terminating SIP trunks with the service provider. You can see it includes an inbound leg, any protocol, any media type, an outbound leg for that inbound call, and you can also fork that call to a call recording server using SIPREG or an API control. Um, Trunk license also allows you to do media encryption and decryption, uh, audio codec transcoding, translating, DTMF interworking, SIP header manipulation, um, and you can have multiple media sessions per call. You can also utilize the underlying UC Gateway Services API, and then you can have stateful high availability, which basically is Cube HA active standby call preservation. That will be the redundant trunk license. So this should give you a good idea what's included in a Cube trunk license. So these are the SKUs when it comes to trunking. We also have a smart licensing SKU around Cube line side, and then we also have one for Cube media proxy. Uh, Line side basically is you have a customer deployment where you only have IP phones, and those IP phones register to the third-party call control in the service provider cloud via a Cube line side, and that is where that line side license is required for the registration, proxy registration of IP phones, and this can be a third-party phone or Cisco MPP devices, and it also offers you survivability in case this business internet goes down, then the Cube can provide a localized dial tone to those IP phones. These line side licenses do not entitle use of trunk features that we showed. And then the Cube Media Proxy is a totally different product outside of Cube Enterprise, and it allows you to fork media for the same call simultaneously up to 5 different recorders. So that has its own licensing. So when it comes to smart licensing, let's take a look at where and what was implemented. So over here in this row, it's the platform technology licensing that I talked about at the start of this section. And then over here at the bottom is the cube licensing. In iOS XE release 16.6 all the way up to iOS XE 16.9, the platform license smart for platform technology licensing, smart licensing is optional, and the cube license is still right to use on paper. With iOS XE 16.10, smart licensing became mandatory for platform technology license, meaning things like your UCK9, SECK9, but the cube licensing was still right to use. Starting iOS XE 16.11 and onwards, for platform, smart licensing mode is mandatory and continued CSSM registration is required to enable Cube features when it comes to platform technology licensing. With iOS XE 16.11, from iOS XE 16.11 to 17.1, the Cube licensing became mandatory smart licensing. However, from when it comes to trunk license requests, those were set by a manual configuration. Meaning, if you remember the mode border element license capacity CLI, whatever number you put in there, that was reported back to CSSM. So, uh, licensing is not policed, meaning that if you go out of compliance, calls will still continue. What that means is that whatever you number you put in this release in the mode border element license capacity, if that number is more than your entitled cube trunk licenses deposited in your smart account, we will not be policing the session count. But continued CSSM registration is mandatory in iOS XE 16.11. Starting iOS XE 17.2, we no longer rely on the mode border element license capacity CLI, and the trunk license requests are dynamically the trunk license usage. The actual session count on the cube is dynamically calculated and reported to CSSM based on a default policy of, let's say, 7 days, or and you can configure default is 7 days, but you can configure it to in minutes or longer or shorter intervals. Again, the session count itself is not policed. So if you go out of compliance on the session count, we will not block calls. But continuous CSSM registration is mandatory from iOS XE 16.11 and onwards for both Cube to utilize Cube features for both platform and Cube licensing. Uh, Today, to CSSM, only trunk license usage is reported. Line side and media proxy is not. And CSR 1000V has required smart licensing from a very long time, the virtual router. So keep that in mind. So this is basically on license reporting. This table gives you details. Um, Again, license consumption reporting in iOS XE releases 16.11, 12, and 17.1 is done through the mode border element license capacity command. It's static and it's optional. The Cube platforms have to be registered to be the smart licensing server, even if the license capacity is not configured. If you're not registered, call processing will be shut down once the evaluation period has expired. Um, this point again over here says that the session count is not enforced. We will show some scenarios in the next slide, and in some of the scenarios in the following slides, we describe license pooling. To ensure the correct number of licenses are consumed from your smart virtual account, we suggest that the average number of licenses required be configured on each device. That is shown in the green configured for on the subsequent slides. And again, as I said, that starting iOS XE 17.2.1 and later, the actual trunk license usage, the actual number of calls happening on the cube is calculated dynamically and reported to CSSM, and the license capacity CLI in the mode border element has been deprecated. Let's go to through some of the Cube version 12.x deployment examples and smart licensing scenarios. Um, Again, they are provided for illustration purposes only. Always refer to the Cube performance documentation, the sizing deck that we have on Sales Connect or cisco.box.com/cube-enterprise to make sure the call processing loads are handleable by the platform. The underlying platform can handle those call processing loads. So in the first one, you have two different locations with two different cubes, right? Location one has a cube, location two has a cube. You're expecting 50 calls on each cube. And what we have done is we have configured 50, and again, there's no geographic redundancy, there's no load balancing. Each location processes up to 50 sessions at any given time. The licensing requirement in this case would be 100 cube uh, trunk standalone, uh, and this is again uh, assumes that the same virtual account is holding these 100 licenses. And if you have different virtual accounts, then you can configure, then you can use those as well. But if you have the same virtual account, then configure 50 on each of the box. So what that means is that um, if this box becomes unavailable, and if the location 2 box has the capacity, it can handle all the 100 calls as well, even though we will configure it for 50. Again, remember, as I mentioned, the session count itself is not policed. Scenario 1B, both of these cubes are in the same location. Each is expected to handle 50 calls, no load balancing, no box-to-box redundancy. Each cube processes 50 calls at any given time. Your smart account holding a pool of 100 licenses can be used in this setup. In this scenario, we are doing geographic load balancing active-active. Two cubes in two separate locations, no box-to-box HA. The load balancing is either provided by the service provider or if you have a cusp, but service provider makes more sense in this case since they are in two different locations. Um, the total call load expected is 200. So from a licensing standpoint, you are required to have 200 cube T standard license in this case, and we recommend again all in the same virtual account, holding these common pool of licenses, and I would recommend configuring each box for 100. Okay, now this is scenario 2B, basically similar to the previous one, but this time both the cubes are in the same location. No cube HA, box-to-box redundancy. In this case, the load balancing is provided by either the service provider or using a cusp, and the total load expected is 200 calls across both the boxes. They're both in the same location. The licensing required will be 200 T standard, and the Cube platforms register to the same virtual account holding a common pool of licenses. Scenario 3 is box-to-box HA with call preservation. An active standby pair of cube, right? Uh, and they definitely have to be in the same location. They are expected to handle 250 calls. So the licensing requirement over here would be 250 cube T read for the number of calls that the active will be handling. Both the Cube platforms register to the same virtual account holding these common pool of licenses. Only the active Cube reports license usage. The next scenario is what we like to refer to as scenario 4A. Two different locations. Each location has a Cube HA box-to-box pair, and the total load across both the locations expected is 600 calls, right? It can be 300 over here, 300 over here, or 600 over here and 0 over here. If location 1 fails, all the calls associated or in progress at that location 1 will fail, right? If only the active fails within that location, then the standby will preserve signaling and media, preserve the calls, take over all call processing. But the whole data center goes down, then there is no movement, then all the calls are indeed lost because CubeHA only works within the data center. So let's say you're expecting 600 calls across both the locations, across both the CubeHA pairs. Uh, what you will need is 600 cube T redundant license, right? Because both of these are doing redundant, right? This is an HA pair, this is an HA pair in both the locations. Again, remember only the active cube reports licensing usage. In scenario 4B is similar to the previous one, but what we have done is we have moved both the cube HA pairs into the same location, and they are both handling 600 calls. So the licensing requirement remains the same based on the total number of calls, cube T read 600 quantity. This is a unique scenario. So you have a primary site and you have a DR site. The primary site has a cube HA pair, right? And that is expected to handle 500 calls. If the active cube goes down, the standby takes over, preserving signaling and media, meaning preserving all the calls. Um, but let's say the primary site completely goes down. The DR site has a standalone cube box, which will be handling those 500 calls. So the licensing requirement in this case, because it's an HA pair, is cube T red, right? So get 500 quantity of cube T red, and what will happen is not only it will provide stateful preservation within the data center, but also fail over to the DR site. Active cubes only report licensing usage. The redundant licenses cover standard licensing requirement. From DR site, the smart account will show license borrowing of 250 standard licenses from the red pool. Okay. Scenario 5 is hardware redundancy, which is 1006 and 1006X boxes, or the software redundancy option. In both of these cases, let's say we are expecting 350 calls. The hardware redundancy is basically uh, um, the stateful switchover feature that is the platform feature. It's not a cube feature, and the software redundancy is what we is known as the route processor redundancy. That is also a underlying iOS XE feature. It's not a cube feature. Both of these options provide stateful failover. If you're expecting 350 calls to be handled by this setup, then all you need is cube T standalone standard license, not redundant, because these are not cube HA redundancy options. These are underlying platform options. So from a cube standpoint, we don't require anything more than beyond than the standard cube trunking license. And then the last one is the line side registration proxy and survivability, the cube line side licenses. Let's say you have four different sites, four different locations. Each location has 25 handsets that is registering to the service provider call control, meaning a total of 100 handsets registering to the service provider call control. What you will need is 100 cube line side cube L standard licenses. Again, all the cubes will be registering to the same virtual account, holding a common pool of licenses. Remember, cube line side license usage is not reported to CSM as of today. Next, we'll talk about quickly license migration. If you have current or if you have any cube platforms with classic right to use licenses, what are valid migration options? So let's take a look at each of them. The first one is case A. You have non-current platforms, the legacy platforms, the ISR G1 and G2 and the ASR 1001, 1002. So the scenario in this case is going from those RTU licenses to smart Cube version 12 smart licenses with Swiss. So so keep in mind the classic right to use Cube session licenses, the paper licenses were node locked to that particular router for which they were purchased, and they remain valid for as long as the customer uses that router and that model has not reached end of support. Beyond that, those licenses have no residual value. So if customers are wishing to wanting to migrate to a newer hardware platform, they must purchase not only the hardware platform but new Cube licenses with those platform with a minimum of 12 months of Swiss. Some of the end of support dates for those platforms are listed over here. Next, what if you have current platforms, ISA 4K series, ASR 1000 series, and VCube, and you had classic RTU licenses, and you wanna migrate to Cube version 12 smart licenses. So the classic, again, RTU licenses were intended to provide perpetual entitlement for the hardware platform in question for which they were purchased. If you want to use software beyond iOS XE 16.9, you may apply to purchase replacement Cube version 12 session licenses, and you have to do that as follows. So the first is you have to do it for the same or more RTU session licenses must have been purchased since October 1st, 2014, right? So those Cube RTU licenses must have been purchased on or after October 1st. You will need to provide the sales order details for those RTU purchases. And then you need to purchase 12 months of Swiss at standard customer discount for all Cube session licenses that you want to convert. Um, so once you do that, a discount of up to 100% on Cube license plates will be supported through a DSA if all the three conditions over here are met. So this one is valid and will remain available until the end of sale of Cube version 12 licenses, which is scheduled for early 2021. So if you have a right to use Cube licenses and you want to go to Cube version 12 licenses, remember that this option is only available till early 2021. After that, standard discounts will apply for the purchase of all Cube licenses and support, and customers may continue to use Cube 12.1 iOS XE69X with classic RTU session licenses. The third one is if you had Cisco One right to use licenses on all Cisco One compatible platforms. So if you have an active Cisco One Swiss contract, you may be transferred to any compatible Cisco One license platform. Cisco One Swiss basically provides entitlement to router software upgrades. With active Cisco One Swiss contract coverages, you can migrate to smart enabled Cube version 12 licenses using these SKUs listed over here, and you will have to renew support with Collaboration Swiss for those Cube session licenses. If you don't have an active Cisco One Swiss contract coverages, then you just basically you cannot migrate and just go back to refer to the previous two cases, case A or case B. So this is basically a summary of what options you have. There's a deck available on Sales Connect that again covers all these license migration scenarios and licensing requirements and the whole 9 yards of Cube licensing in detail. So that's it for the Cube licensing section within this video.